Right. Welcome to another deep dive. This one, well, it's been crafted with you in mind specifically.
Indeed.
We're thinking of you as, a philosopher king.
Yeah.
And we know you're keen to, grasp big ideas
Yeah.
quickly but thoroughly.
Yes, and of course, appreciating those different angles and perspectives.
Yeah.
And coming away with those aha moments, but without, getting bogged down.
Exactly.
Not overwhelmed.
Definitely not overwhelmed. So for today's material, it's a bit dense but fascinating. We're diving into Nelson Goodman's aesthetics.
Yes. And our source for this is, of course, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entries. So think of this as a sort of guided tour.
Yeah, through the ideas of this hugely influential contemporary philosopher, his perspective on art.
And specifically its symbolic function, how those symbols work, how they create meaning.
Right, right. Because our mission here, and this is especially for you, with your philosophical inclinations, we want to pull out the sharpest, most relevant parts of Goodman's theory of art. The ideas that will really resonate with someone who's used to, thinking about the big questions.
The deep questions of reality and knowledge. Exactly.
Yeah, that's it. And one thing that might surprise you, we're going to see how Goodman doesn't see art as this, separate thing, just about beauty and feelings.
No, quite the opposite.
He actually sees it as a genuine way of understanding the world, even as a form of world building.
Yes, very much intertwined with science and everyday experience, really.
Okay, so where do we even begin?
Well, with the man himself, I suppose, Nelson Goodman. He wasn't just some art critic. He was a major force in, well, pretty much the whole landscape of analytic philosophy.
Right. I mean, he was writing about logic, metaphysics, how we know things, even the philosophy of science.
Yeah, but it was his book, Languages of Art, published in 1968, that really changed the game, especially for Anglo-American philosophers grappling with those questions about art.
And right from the start, one of his most striking arguments is that art isn't this, isolated realm.
No, not at all.
Not just beauty and emotion, no. He says artworks, whether they're paintings or music or dance, they're all symbols, fundamentally.
Symbols, yes. And these symbols, they're not so different from the theory scientists use or even the concepts we use every day.
And what they do is they actively classify reality. They organize it for us.
Now, for a mind like yours, always probing the foundations of things, I think it's helpful to consider the influences on Goodman's thinking.
Yeah, the roots of his ideas.
He was deeply engaged with cognitivism, the idea that our minds don't passively absorb information. We actively process and interpret it.
So we're not just mirrors reflecting the world. We're shaping it as we perceive it.
Precisely. And then there's his nominalism. He believed that those grand, abstract universals,
like truth or beauty with a capital T and B.
Yes, those kinds of things. He argued they don't exist out there independently. They're tied to our language, to our symbols.
They're tools we create.
Exactly. And on top of all that, he was also a relativist and a constructivist, meaning he believed we actively build the realities we experience through those symbolic systems. The worlds we know are not just given to us, they're in many ways made by us, through the symbols we use, the categories we create.
That's a powerful idea. We are world makers, in a way, through our symbols.
Precisely. And that idea of constructing worlds through symbols is really the heart of Goodman's whole project.
And to grasp that, I think it's worth taking a quick look at his earlier work, Fact, Fiction, and Forecast.
Ah, yes, where he introduces that famous new riddle of induction.
Which, I'll admit, can be a bit head-spinning. Do you want to try and unpack it?
Well, it starts with the simple observation that we've only ever seen emeralds that are green.
Right, right. Every emerald, green as can be.
But that doesn't logically mean that all future emeralds will be green, does it?
I guess not logically. But come on, they've always been green.
But that's where Goodman gets clever. He introduces this idea of grue. Imagine an object is grue if it's been observed to be green up to a certain point in time and will be blue after that.
Grue. Okay, so all the emeralds we've seen, they fit the definition of grue just as well as they fit green, right?
Precisely. They could all suddenly turn blue tomorrow, and it wouldn't contradict our past observations. So the question becomes, why do we project green into the future and not grue?
That's the riddle, isn't it? Why green and not grue?
And the answer, Goodman argues, isn't about some inherent logical superiority of the predicate green. It comes down to habit.
Habit, as in what we're used to.
Exactly. We've always called emeralds green, so we keep doing it. It's become entrenched.
It's like a well-worn path in our thinking.
That's a great way to put it. And the point is, this applies to all sorts of classifications, not just colors. Our seemingly obvious ways of dividing up the world, they're not logically necessary. They're ingrained habits.
Like Goodman famously said, regularities are where you find them, and you can find them anywhere.
Exactly. We choose to see certain patterns, and that shapes how we understand the world.
And this is where it gets really exciting, I think, because Goodman applies this to art.
Yes, he takes that idea of projection, of imposing our categories on the world, and he says, look, when we do this successfully with artistic symbols, it actually changes how we see reality. It's not just labeling, it's a form of world building.
It's like we're painting the world with our symbols, both literally and metaphorically.
And understanding art then becomes very similar to understanding any other symbolic system, whether it's science or just everyday language. It's about interpreting those symbols, seeing how they fit together.
It's about the shared habits of a community, what they've come to accept as valid, what styles are familiar, what formulas they see as literal versus metaphorical, and so on. And all of this is built on these chosen, entrenched symbolic systems.
Which leads us nicely to Languages of Art.
His masterpiece, right?
Yes, published in 1968. But don't be misled by the title. It's not just about painting or sculpture. The subtitle is An Approach to a General Theory of Symbols.
So it's really about how all symbols function, not just in art.
Exactly. He's laying out a framework for understanding symbols of all kinds. Words, pictures, gestures, diagrams, how they refer, how they create meaning, how they work together.
And a crucial part of this, I think, is that he doesn't see a sharp dividing line between art and science. They're both engaged in this project of making sense of the world, just using different tools.
And for Goodman, this use of symbols in art, it's not just about expressing feelings or being creative.
It's not just self-expression or decoration.
No, it's deeper than that. He sees it as profoundly cognitive. It's about knowledge, about understanding. He actually argues for a kind of cognitivism in art, saying that by engaging with artistic symbols, we're actually discovering and building the worlds we inhabit.
So aesthetics, the study of art and beauty, isn't just some side project for him.
No, it's right at the heart of epistemology.
The theory of knowledge.
Precisely. For him, those different forms of art, they're all made up of symbols. And those symbols have different functions. They relate to the world in different ways. So to really understand art, you have to be able to interpret those symbols, to figure out what they're referring to, how they do it, and what system of rules they're operating under.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't this concept of reference really central to Goodman's whole theory of symbols?
Absolutely. It's the core idea. You see, for Goodman, to symbolize is essentially to refer.
To refer, meaning what?
Meaning to stand for something else. Like the word king refers to you, your majesty. But Goodman emphasizes two key points here.
Okay, lay them on me.
First, reference isn't just one thing. It's not a monolithic concept. It comes in different modes.
So different ways of standing for something.
Exactly. And second, something only functions as a symbol, and a symbol of a particular kind within a specific system of symbols.
The system with its own rules, its own logic.
Exactly. Natural languages, like the one we're speaking now, are the most obvious examples. But Goodman shows that pictorial systems, gestures, diagrams, they all function as symbols within their own systems.
Okay, so let's dig into these different modes of reference. You mentioned that there are multiple ways a symbol can stand for something. What are those?
Well, Goodman starts with two fundamental modes, denotation and exemplification. Denotation is the most straightforward. It's the relationship between a label and what it refers to. Like the name Alexander the Great denotes a specific historical figure.
Okay, so a name points to a person. Simple enough.
But it can be more general, too. A description like, let's say, the philosopher king's predecessor would denote whoever ruled before you.
Okay, so labels can be specific or general. Got it.
Right. And now, tying back to his nominalism, Goodman argues that even having a certain quality or feature, like, say, being wise...
That's a quality I aspire to, of course.
Of course, of course. Well, Goodman says that even having that quality is fundamentally about being denoted by a certain label, by a predicate, like the word wise.
So possession of a quality becomes a kind of reverse denotation.
Exactly. It's about which labels apply to you. And these labels, they don't have to be words. They can be pictures, musical symbols, all sorts of things. Anything that can function as a label, picking out and classifying some aspect of the world.
Okay, so that's denotation. What about this exemplification? You said it's a bit more subtle.
Yes, it's a bit trickier. Let's imagine a royal seal. Okay.
I'm just picturing it.
Now, that seal might be made of gold, right?
Naturally.
And the word gold denotes the seal because it's made of that material.
Okay, denotation, we've got that.
But that seal, it also serves as a kind of sample of gold, doesn't it? It represents the kingdom's wealth or the quality of its craftsmanship, and that's exemplification. It requires possession, in this case, the seal actually being made of gold, but it also requires this reference back to the label itself, back to the word gold.
So it's not just that it has the property of being gold, it's that it's also pointing back to the concept of gold.
Exactly. It's possession plus reference, as Goodman puts it. The feature isn't just there, it's being actively exhibited, shown forth.
Like a tailor swatch.
Yeah.
It's not just any piece of fabric, it's specifically there to show what that fabric is like.
Precisely. Any golden object is denoted by the word gold, but only certain things, like that royal seal or the tailor's swatch, actually exemplify gold because they're used in a way that draws attention to that property, that makes it relevant to their function.
So it's about what the sample is meant to show us, what it's emphasizing.
Exactly, and that's why context is so important. The significance of what a sample exemplifies depends entirely on how it's being used.
I see. So exemplification is like a kind of selective highlighting. It picks out certain features and makes them stand out.
And Goodman argues that this is happening all over the place, not just with physical samples. He uses it to explain all sorts of aesthetic phenomena. Expression in art, artistic style, how architecture carries meaning, even the idea of variations on a theme in music or painting.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me. Because Goodman doesn't stop at these two basic modes of reference.
Oh no, he goes much further. He recognizes that reference can take many different paths.
And he even brings in metaphor.
Yes, metaphor. That's a perfect example of reference going beyond the literal, calling a wise ruler a lion.
A classic metaphor. But how does that fit into his theory?
Well, Goodman argues that labels, those symbols we use to refer to things, they don't exist in isolation. They're part of what he calls schemata, families of labels that are typically connected to a certain realm of reference.
Okay, schemata and realms. Give me an example.
Sure. Think about the words gold, silver, and bronze. They belong to a schema of metals.
Okay, and their realm of reference would be all the things made of those metals, right?
Precisely. All the golden objects, all the silver objects, and so on. Now, metaphorical reference happens when you take a label from one schema and apply it to something outside its usual realm.
So like calling a painting melancholy. That's taking a word normally used for feelings, for a mental state, and applying it to a physical object.
Exactly. And Goodman argues that this metaphorical transfer isn't just a quirk of language. It's a fundamental way that we create new meanings, new ways of understanding the world.
And this is where it gets really philosophical, because Goodman says that metaphorical truth is just as real, just as connected to knowledge as literal truth.
Yes, he doesn't see a sharp separation between them. They're on a continuum. And whether a label's application is literal or metaphorical often comes down to habit, to how old the metaphor is.
He has that great line about how a metaphor is an affair between a predicate with a past and an object that yields while protesting.
Yes. It beautifully captures how metaphors, at first, they create a kind of tension. They force us to see something in a new light, even if it feels a bit strange. But over time, they can reshape our thinking. They become part of how we see the world.
So it's not just a mislabeling. It's an act of creation, of expanding our understanding.
Precisely. And Goodman points out that this kind of metaphorical transfer is at work in all sorts of rhetorical devices. Not just metaphor, but personification, irony, hyperbole. He also makes the point that a single item can do multiple referential jobs at the same time. It can denote some things, exemplify others, and those references can be literal or metaphorical. And then there's the idea of chains of reference.
Chains of reference.
Yes, where reference goes through multiple steps, multiple symbols. Think about how, say, a portrait of your royal crown can refer to you, to your authority. The picture itself denotes the physical crown. But the crown itself exemplifies certain qualities, like power and legitimacy. And those qualities, in turn, denote you, the ruler. And you, in turn, arguably exemplify those qualities in your actions and decisions.
So it's a whole chain of meaning connecting symbols to each other and to the world?
Exactly. And that's how Goodman sees reference working. It's not always a simple one-to-one relationship. It can be layered and complex.
Okay, so we've talked about reference, about these different modes of reference, but how does all of this connect back to those symbol systems you mentioned earlier?
Well, that's where Goodman makes a distinction between a symbol scheme and a symbol system.
A scheme versus a system. Okay, what's the difference?
A symbol scheme is simply a collection of symbols. Think of the alphabet of your kingdom's language. That's a scheme.
Okay, a set of basic building blocks.
Exactly. But a symbol system is more than that. It's a scheme plus a set of rules for how to combine those basic symbols. So, in your kingdom's language, the rules of grammar, how to form words and sentences from those letters, those are part of the system.
So the scheme is the raw material, the system is how you put it together.
Precisely. And each character in the system, whether it's a letter, a word, a musical note, it encompasses all the physical instances of that symbol, all the different ways it can be written or spoken or played. And the main way these systems refer is through denotation. Those characters denote things in their field of reference.
And the scheme is governed by what Goodman calls syntactic rules, right? Like the rules of grammar, how to combine the symbols.
Yes, the syntax. And then the system as a whole is governed by semantic rules. Those are the rules about how these combinations actually refer, about what they mean. It's like having a bag of letters versus having the rules to actually use those letters to form words and sentences.
Okay, syntax and semantics, got it. But there's this other word, notation, that seems to be really important for Goodman. What exactly does he mean by that?
Notation is crucial for understanding how Goodman differentiates between different kinds of symbol systems. In his specific sense, a notation is a very precise kind of system where each symbol corresponds uniquely to one item in its field of reference and vice versa. There's no ambiguity, no overlap.
Like a perfect code.
Exactly. And he uses the example of a musical score to illustrate this. Ideally, a musical score should function as a character in a notational system, meaning it should perfectly determine which performances count as belonging to that work, and every legitimate performance should be equally determined by that score. No room for interpretation or variation.
And for a scheme to be notational, it has to meet certain requirements, right?
Yes, two key syntactic requirements. First, what he calls disjointness, meaning each physical mark, each instance of the symbol belongs to only one character. There's no ambiguity about what symbol it is.
Like each letter of the alphabet has its own unique form.
Precisely. And second, finite differentiation, or what he sometimes calls articulation. This means it's always theoretically possible to determine which character a given mark instantiates. You can always tell which symbol it is, even if the mark is a bit messy or imperfect.
So in a perfect notation, every symbol has a distinct and unambiguous form.
Exactly. You can think of it like digital measurement. For any given reading, there's a definite answer to what the measurement is. No in-between, no fuzziness.
And this is where the contrast with non-notational systems comes in, right?
Yes, those are more like analog measurement. They lack that clear-cut articulation. They're what Goodman calls dense throughout, meaning between any two marks in the system, there's a potentially infinite number of other possible characters. Like, think about a painting. Even the slightest variation in a brushstroke can potentially make a difference to the meaning of the work.
So it's not just about the symbols themselves, it's about how they're physically realized.
Exactly. And for a symbol system to be truly notational, it needs more than just these syntactic features. It also needs semantic disjointness and finite differentiation, meaning, on the semantic side, each symbol can only refer to one class of things. Those classes can't overlap, and it should always be clear which symbol applies to a given item in the world.
Okay, so it has to be precise both in its form and in its meaning.
Precisely. And this is where natural languages get interesting. They have notational schemes, like the alphabet, but they're not fully notational systems.
Because words can have multiple meanings, they can be ambiguous.
Exactly. And their realms of reference can overlap. A word like bank can refer to a financial institution or the edge of a river.
Okay, I see. And what about pictures? Where do they fit into this?
Goodman argues that pictorial systems fail on both syntactic and semantic grounds. They're inherently dense.
Both in their form and their meaning.
Yes, because even the smallest variations in a picture can potentially be meaningful, and those variations can correspond to different things in the world. It's not a one-to-one mapping like a perfect notation.
Okay, so we've laid out this whole framework of reference and symbol systems. Now, how does Goodman use it to talk about specific aesthetic issues, like, for example, pictorial representation?
Yes, how pictures represent the world. That's where things get really interesting and a bit controversial, because Goodman's view of pictures is, well, it's pretty radical. He argues that their primary symbolic function is denotation.
Just like words?
Yes, essentially. He sees pictures as a kind of pictorial label. They pick out and classify things in the world just like linguistic predicates do with words.
So a picture of a tree is like the word tree. They both denote the same thing.
Precisely. But of course, there are differences.
Obviously. A picture isn't just a word.
Of course not. And Goodman acknowledges that. He says the key difference, and this is crucial, is that pictorial systems are the very opposite of a notation. They exhibit density, both syntactically and semantically.
Density meaning?
Meaning, just like with diagrams and maps, even the smallest mark or variation in color can potentially be meaningful in a picture. It's all crammed full of potentially significant details, and those details can correspond to different things in the world.
So a picture is like a densely woven tapestry, where every thread contributes to the overall pattern.
That's a good analogy. And Goodman even uses this term, syntactic repleteness, to describe how many different visual elements can be contributing meaningfully to the picture, whereas in a simple diagram, maybe only the relative positions of a few lines matter.
Okay, I see. But what about pictures that don't depict a specific thing in the world? Like a picture of a soldier, but not any particular soldier, just a generic soldier.
Ah, yes. Or a picture of a mythical creature, like a griffin, that doesn't even exist.
Right, right. How does that work if pictures are all about denotation?
Well, Goodman handles those cases with the concepts of multiple and null denotation.
Okay, multiple and null. Break it down for me.
So a picture of a soldier, in that general sense, it denotes all members of the set of soldiers. It's picking out a category.
A kind of multiple labeling.
Exactly. Now, a picture of a griffin, since griffins don't exist, it has null denotation. It doesn't point to anything in the real world.
But it's still a picture of something, even if that something is fictional.
Exactly. And Goodman says that this doesn't undermine his claim that denotation is central to representation, because we still categorize these pictures as representing certain types of things. A soldier picture versus a griffin picture, even if there's no actual griffin to point to.
Okay, I think I'm following. But it seems like Goodman's view of depiction is a bit ambiguous. It's sort of stuck between being a picture of something and being a so-and-so picture, as he puts it.
Yes, and some philosophers have seen this as a weakness of his theory. They argue that it doesn't really explain how pictures actually relate to the world, why they depict what they do.
They say he's more focused on the roots of reference than the roots.
Exactly. He's interested in how symbols refer, not so much in why a particular picture resembles its subject or how that connection was established in the first place. And Goodman admits this. He says he's primarily interested in the logic of symbols, not in their history or psychology. He's more concerned with the roots of reference, how symbols connect, than the roots, how those connections were formed.
So he's not trying to give us a perceptual theory of depiction. He's not explaining how our visual system processes images.
No, he's taking a more abstract approach. He's saying, look, whatever the underlying mechanism, ultimately, pictures function as symbols within a system. And the rules of that system are what determine how they refer what they depict.
And he sees this as a strength of his approach.
Yes, because it allows him to talk about representation in a very general way across different art forms, even across different symbolic systems.
Okay, then what about this question of resemblance? Isn't that what makes pictures different from other kinds of symbols? They actually look like the things they represent.
That's the common assumption, yes. But Goodman famously rejects that. He gives a whole bunch of arguments against resemblance as the defining feature of depiction.
Okay, let's hear them. Why does he think resemblance is not enough?
Well, his main point is that resemblance is just too widespread. Anything can resemble anything else in some way if you look at it the right way.
So it's too vague, too relative.
Exactly. It all depends on what features you're focusing on, what system of correlation you're using. And he argues that those systems are ultimately conventional. They're based on our shared habits or cultural norms. He even says that the rules of perspective, which we often think of as objective, are actually just conventions that we've learned to accept. It's like saying that we understand traffic signs because they resemble actual road hazards. The connection is symbolic, not based on visual similarity. We've been taught what those signs mean.
So for Goodman, seeing is always seeing as.
Exactly. He echoes Ernst Gombrich's famous line, that we know what we see is no truer than that we see what we know.
Our knowledge shapes our perception.
Precisely. And he completely rejects the idea of an innocent eye. He says there's no such thing as pure, unmediated vision. Our perception is always shaped by our needs, our expectations, our categories.
So what does this mean for realism in art? If resemblance isn't the key, how do we distinguish between realistic and non-realistic pictures?
For Goodman, realism isn't about accuracy, about capturing the world as it truly is. It's about familiarity. It's about using a style of representation that we've become accustomed to.
So realistic pictures are just those that are painted in a way that we're used to seeing.
Precisely. He says even something like a photograph, which we might think of as capturing reality directly, it still relies on conventions.
The convictions of
Yes,
photography.
exactly. The framing, the focus, the lighting, all of that shapes how we see the image. And those choices are ultimately based on cultural norms, on what we've come to expect from photographs.
So for Goodman, realism is a matter of habit, not of truth.
Exactly. And that applies to all forms of representation, not just painting. Even something like a scientific diagram, which we might think of as objective, it still relies on conventions.
So to understand any picture, you always need a key, as he puts it.
Yes, a key to the system of representation being used. Sometimes that key is obvious, it's just part of our cultural background, but other times we might need to learn the conventions, the specific rules of the game.
Okay, so that's Goodman on depiction. But what about expression in art? How does he explain how a piece of music can make us feel joyful even though it doesn't literally experience emotions?
That's where exemplification comes back in. Goodman argues that many art forms, things like music, abstract painting, architecture, they don't directly represent anything in the world, but they can still be incredibly meaningful. They can express things, evoke feelings.
And he says they do this by exemplifying certain qualities.
Exactly. He says that artworks can draw attention to some of their own features. They can highlight them, make them stand out. And when an artwork seems to have a quality that it doesn't literally possess, like a painting expressing sadness, Goodman says it's metaphorically exemplifying that quality, or, in more common language, expressing it.
So expression for him is a kind of metaphorical exemplification.
Precisely. It's about taking a label, a predicate, that normally applies to one kind of thing and applying it to something else. And he emphasizes that this is not just about emotions. A building can express dynamism, a sense of grandeur, any quality that can be metaphorically attributed.
Okay, I see. But this metaphorical exemplification, this expression, it's still relative, right? Just like representation.
Absolutely. It's always relative to the established use of symbols within a particular system. You can't just take any label and slap it onto anything. There have to be rules, conventions, shared understandings.
And Goodman's concept exemplification helps to explain why we pay attention to the artwork itself, not just to what it might represent.
Yes. We're interested in those features it displays, the qualities it exemplifies. Like in poetry, what the poem exemplifies through its sound and rhythm can be just as important as its literal meaning.
It's about the form as much as the content.
Exactly. And by broadening the scope of expression beyond just emotions, Goodman's theory becomes much more powerful. It can account for all sorts of ways that artworks can be meaningful, even if they don't have a clear referent in the world.
Now, there's a tricky question here, I think. Does possession have to come before exemplification? Like, does a painting have to actually be serene before it can express serenity?
Yes, that's a good question. And it gets to the heart of how Goodman sees the relationship between symbols and the qualities they exemplify. It's definitely worth pondering whether maybe the very act of using a symbol to exemplify a quality actually gives the artwork that quality. Like maybe by calling a painting serene, we actually make it serene in some way.
We project that quality onto it.
Exactly. And this seems especially relevant in the realm of art, where we're constantly using symbols to create new meanings and experiences. But whether Goodman's framework can fully account for that is an open question. Some philosophers have argued that by focusing so much on symbol systems, he might be missing something important about how artistic meaning is created.
Like the role of the artist's intention, or the context in which the work is produced.
Right. Maybe there's more to it than just the rules of the system. Maybe there's something about the act of creation itself that imbues the work with certain qualities, certain expressive potential.
Okay, so that's a point to ponder. But let's move on to another big question. The identity of artworks. What makes a particular artwork that artwork and not something else?
Well, for Goodman, this question is all about the symbol systems involved. He uses his theory of symbols to explain how different kinds of artworks are individuated, how we tell them apart. And a key factor for him is whether the work's history, how it was produced, is essential to its identity.
And this is where his famous distinction between autographic and allographic arts comes in, right?
Exactly. Autographic arts are those where the difference between the original and a copy, even a perfect copy, is really important.
So, like a painting, if you have a perfect forgery, it's still not the same as the original.
Right. Because in autographic arts, the work's identity is tied to its specific physical embodiment, to the object itself and its history.
So painting, drawing, printmaking, those are all autographic.
Yes, and also sculpture. Anything where the object itself is considered unique and irreplaceable.
Okay, and then allographic arts are the opposite.
Yes, those are the arts where the work can be instantiated in multiple ways without losing its identity, like music performed from a score, a play enacted from a script, literature. Those are all allographic.